No.
I'm sure you'll be there.
I left my bike at work. And the plan is to potentially take a bike to bike that way, like my option. Oh, no, I work in downtown. I went right across the river to
And it is live.
there's a Japanese
Egg salad sandwich.
cafe there, yeah.
No one's on there.
Yeah.
Would you got here one, please?
So you're thinking for the giraffe?
Let's go. That's great. Good lunch spot. These little lunch to go sandwiches are really handy.
Yeah, I like the sandwiches. Last week I was really wishing that I had a coffee with me. Yeah, I do. Courtesy of your.
Oh, it's not even on the thing.
Actually, well, there's. Although it's not very. I like the way. I like the theory
I
of
didn't
it.
realize that was what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
I'm a very pleasing caricature.
I'm impressed because they like sell a lot of stuff. So the impact actually
Probably fails.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I said good morning when I walked in here. I need to drink some of this.
It's one of those days.
It should be Friday.
I did actually think it was Friday.
It's been a really long week. Sorry to ruin yours, but
I don't have anything to do tomorrow, fortunately. So.
I have a deadline to fail at.
In hours a day?
Friday.
Self-employed for a while, but I so.
Taxes. That's the worst part.
I mean, I was making so little, I was paying like nothing.
I have the opposite experience where it seems like the less I make, the more I pay.
Okay.
A lot of taxes, extremely high for taxes. I realize I'm the only voice in the room right now. I want to know I love paying my taxes. I definitely pay a lot of them.
There we go.
I have not been able to conceive of a function that
Yeah, I'm not subscribed. But until a couple of years ago, I actually started paying a proper accounting firm. That got great. That's what's the best.
Oh, I have two kids, so. But
We get like little credits, so yeah.
I actually have lots of space.
I have to say his name out loud if you're thinking of the person. You know.
Like a, yeah, you're in the president.
Oh, I think we were talking about the person who did. He's there at the moment.
No. That's like.
I logged in and I can hear things well.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there we go. The tax plan, which is not great at all. Yeah. I can make it less bad, by pushing for it. Yeah.
I think the issue we're having.
I was also like,
The last, the big bad tariff tax.
I know like last year I like from the touch watching that or whatever. And I was like watching people.
But a lot of people are just like, wow, big number.
And I couldn't find it. I think they like took it down. I was thinking about asking them.
I don't think anyone.
I think my neighbor over there. Like I'm up with like a super block. You like just where would I put the
Actually,
makeshift like traffic.
fortunately, a lot of people just reply to me personally. I've just been abusing that for a while.
That's
It's leaving.
and then like during rush hours.
I'll probably be able to turn you guys.
Close to 10.
Probably 30.
That was the trick. I'm tired.
Yeah.
It's like
One or
two and a half.
one block and then you go back to
I'm
church.
still-
It's just like
Yeah, I
right? They're nice.
a crew is not. Yeah, it's not ideal.
So, I've been
Um,
class, for example.
So something else, one thing I was thinking. The other one is.
Called iMovie, that recklessness I was talking about.
Yeah. Microsoft's like Apple. The Microsoft document that I imported.
More like just like from the
Yeah. Just but
I drank my time because it's kind of like nothing from your house. Sort of like this.
Probably take up more than we were, and you were never doing.
Walking through the parking lot.
Yeah, it's.
When you like check out.
Especially if you have like a trail telling them security is still there. About that before. Or I would follow up with an email afterwards, like, everything we
Were you
talked
at the White House anniversary by chance?
I
I think it was in one that last month.
Well, by
Yeah. I was there. Yeah, no, I think I saw you there. I'm not sure.
Who's the main sponsor? Street Trust?
No, it's Butterfly.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Okay.
They're always layered.
What happened, around like, basically like the cities are cooperating with building like safer streets and safer bike lanes and like more like a, they build, the way to go out with like barrels.
Yeah.
But like I thought I saw you there.
Part of something else like DSA?
Yeah.
Like a quasi-anarchist idea for their
Yeah,
students.
yeah. They also feel potholes. They feel potholes.
Is bike lane going to be my favorite radio? Or no one listens to radio? Well, there's a fair amount of non-profit groups and artists and creators that do programs. So, have you done any favorite readers?
No, I haven't.
There's younger women hosts. Some of us were asking her live call. She was talking about climate justice. I said, well, so it's a good idea. I've had it. She said, no, that's regulation. Since you wrote that, is kind of important. Sumi is like the right of the family.
I'm working, yeah.
At my daughter.
No, it's still like the DeMull were on I work with the street restaurant
So you don't go off the plate.
Yeah. Anyway, I work with the street restaurant.
Okay, you were in the street trust. So who's directing?
Lynn.
She used to be here. That one. You left a note. You left a note. I had to go up the elevators and walk around there. You used to be on stick that because that's natural.
Yeah, because I hear there's traffic and accidents everywhere, but we are at 6:40, so I still want to get started.
I really enjoyed it.
Have you seen any information?
So who watched the video from?
I was curious if they changed it because the income went down.
Yeah, no.
I got 3 responses. What was your take from watching those videos? Would you share?
Oh, I mean, I'm kind of already like pretty sort of in touch with all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I go to Columbia River, like the dam situation. I mean, I thought it was like a pretty interesting video. Like, it was like how they like sort of built their traditional canoes and like rode up the river. Yeah.
So one of the biggest feedback I got from last week was how are the dams out in Columbia River Gorge related to what's going on here in Portland? And I think being able to recognize what's out there and how if the dam, the construction of the dam, or if there's anything that happens to the dam does impact Portland, and looking outside of the box of anything that creates elsewhere also impacts Portland. And one of the things I really wanted to bring up last week, we didn't get a chance to, was the formation even of the Missoula floods and how it came in and scoured our city, and the reasons why I-84 is as swirly and whiny as it is because of scouring of the Missoula flood. So there are a lot of impacts from elsewhere that comes in and impacts our city, our traffic, and how we travel, bike, ped, and with streetcar and light rail and how things have developed over time. So it wasn't, the connections were not very well made last week with the technical difficulties that we had, but I just wanted to also let you be aware that whatever happens downstream and upstream with the river also impacts what we feel here. But one of the feedbacks we got from the viewers of the third video was thinking and empathy for communities that have been neglected in the past. Any more feedback from last week's class that you want to bring up before we head in? Yes.
Yeah, I enjoyed all the videos. I think kind of how this got me thinking about transportation or this class is, we might have a really good idea in our mind, but I really don't like I-5 and how they want to move it closer to Harriet Tubman, but I do think, like, if you were somebody who does drive, you you would want, the state or whoever to try to make your drive easier. So as much as I disagree with that, I do see how, try to empathize with other people and how they might feel.
Yeah.
Oh, it was just like an interesting take on, like how stakeholders were engaged on, just like big mega projects,
Yeah.
80 years ago, and how that's, really evolved. And also, like, as I was watching the video, I thought a lot about, I went up to Olympic National Park 2 years ago, and if you go up and visit, there's a dam that you can see that was on the Elwha that they took down a few years ago. And it's a really powerful experience. You can see like a really beautiful placard on like what has changed since they've done that in terms of like the nature of the area and sort of like how the river spread. And I don't know, just a powerful example of, what a mega project that might seem, good in the moment, how views can evolve on it, as people learn more about the different impacts on it. So it's just interesting.
Yeah, because we always working on some sort of mega project within the city or outside.
It was just a comment on the power of narrative and storytelling. And this is not a critique of the filmmaker, because every film or documentary has an angle, right? Because it's the person behind the camera, right, or so to speak. And so there was one comment at one point where they were like, oh, and the electricity, and it lit up the city, and it showed pictures of Portland and all these lights. And you made a comment that actually that energy was for rural communities. Again, not a criticism of the documentarian, but just more of like a small details can really change a narrative a lot. And the fact that we had a prerogative, which was to uplift the voices that are not normally heard, but oftentimes we can, like who controls that narrative, and small details can really make a big difference. And just, kind of just being aware of that, what you exclude or what you include. And,
That's important. Can we start class today? Yeah.
Well, as you know from past classes, I'm somewhat interested in speakers per se.
Yeah.
And I can ask you in other venues, of course, but since we're here, at Portland State, we have a group that works on stuff related to transit quite a bit. But the people that were suggested, which you might already have on the speakers list, Chloe Daly, because she's in charge of transportation for City Council. I understand Jill from Street Roots might come, or Street Trust.
Yes,
Jill
we'll be
Weller,
here
who used to be a
all night.
PSU teacher. And Doug Kelsey, who's GM of TriMet, and Ozzy Gonzalez, who's on the board of TriMet, but also running for mayor against me.
So we cannot have Ozzy because he's running for mayor due to ethical reasons with the candidacy. So it's beyond my control, but I did reach out to Ozzy. I did spoke with him, and same might be true with Commissioner Uzelli. So you and I can have this conversation offline, but I welcome your feedback. And
Doug Kelsey, who's just kind of pay raised to 300,000 as general manager of TriMet.
We'll bring someone from TriMet Maine, and I'll let you know who that may be. So class list. So we've got a handout coming through, and then I'm gonna ask you. Yeah, so I'm gonna talk about the class project, and also, actually, let's do this here. Let's do this here. Now, you guys have asked about this. Give me 5 minutes. I'm going to talk about the class project before we present our guest speakers. So it's I'm framing the project very similarly to what had been taught previously. I haven't changed it so much because I still wanted to keep the legacy. So the handout is going around. Here, let's do half and half. It's kind of a condensed schedule because it started a little later than I had hoped, but take a look at it. the intent is for you to work on a project that's specific to you for something that you want to advocate for. So the questions you want to ask is, what type of traffic issues would you like to address in your community? And how would you improve a particular traffic concern you have as an advocate for your community? So the purpose of the class is to break down and solve the problems as a professional, or what you would learn from this class and the connections that I can help you make within the agency, either it's PBOT or TriMet. But the purpose of the class project essentially is to break the problem down into a process that you can work through one step at a time. So week by week, there'll be an assignment that you will report back to. And if you look further, we are in week 3, but I'm starting this in week 4. So initially what you want to do is describe your transportation problem. What is the problem you want to address? It could be a curb ramp, or it could be a program in which you're working on. It could be essentially any type of projects that you feel related that is personal, maybe personal to you, but also for the betterment of the community. So define the problem, define the issue, and email me a response by next week, October 22nd, I think that's Wednesday. So I have it. And then as you go through week 5, is to help you, the questions you want to answer is, or the assignment then is to identify the possible solutions to your transportation project and prepare a map or a physical representation of your project. Week 6 is to discuss your problems with a responsible public agency representative. So if it's a transit project, then I can help you connect with somebody at TriMet. Or if it's a street project, then we can identify, or you could do some Google search or however it is. How would you tackle that problem? Who would you talk to? So expand your network beyond. Is it a community member? Is it a nonprofit? Is it somebody that you need to talk to outside of the agency space that would help answer your questions? And then we will report your discussion of possible solutions and issues in class. So that becomes a dialogue that we can have within our setting. Week 7 is to describe your preferred solution and discuss the key issues in selecting that solution. Week 8 is to look at what major barriers that would prevent your solution from being implemented. That happens a lot. I've had projects that have shelved. Major, massive mega projects that have shelved, may not come back. Sometimes it's funding, sometimes it's who's in office next, however it is. And then week 9 is our last week together, and so that'll be December 5th. So it's a week after Thanksgiving. It's the first week of December, and then we'll do presentations.
So there's not a December 12th one?
We had talked about it. That was the one thing that I also wanted to bring up is this is a 10-week course, but there's also a Thanksgiving in there. So I didn't plan on it. I did it differently from the previous course where we didn't hold a field trip unless you want to. And the other question is if we could hold a December 12th class as a field trip, but I don't know if you guys all want to do that as a group out if it's late and dark. We can discuss it as a group what you want to do. But what we have posted online was it December 5th. You can correct me if I'm wrong on there, Sarah.
I think it was because it was also the week of finals.
Yes, and that was a week of finals.
On the 12th, that week of 12th.
Yeah. Yes.
How do we narrow down our projects if you've got like 2 or 3 of them circling in your head?
Talk to me.
Do you pick something just really small, or what's better, to pick something really tiny or to pick something that is not actually going to happen?
You're assuming the big one happens.
So like I live in John's Landing, which it's macadam that goes. It's State Highway 43.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
And it is a 4-lane road there, I guess 2 on each side. Does that make it a 2-lane road or a 4-lane road? I don't know.
4-lane.
Okay. It's really dangerous for pedestrians and just to get down to the water.
Yeah.
But nothing I'm gonna do in the next 12 weeks is gonna change that. On the other hand, somebody needs to start talking about it.
You can start the conversation then. So
Is
it
that
could be
too
as
big?
big
Is that
as you
too big a
want.
project?
It could be as big as you want versus as narrow as you want. But just look at the time frame in which we have. So my project when I took this class was medical transportation for the elderly community. And I fully could have followed up on that and see where it went. And I probably may at some point. But I think the opportunity for you is really to think outside the box and think outside your space. And if it's something that is important to you that you want to bring up, some of these projects have in the past have been implemented. But as a state highway project 43, that is, you're jumping through a lot of hoops. But if you start the conversation with ODOT, perhaps, who knows? Yeah.
So week 4, there's an actual practical thing, which is emailing you a description of what we want to do. Week 5, 6, and so on. Do you want answers to these questions sent to you, or is this like a class discussion thing, or is this really just sort of for pacing to make sure that we're chunking through the project at a good?
This is actually assignments that I
Okay.
was answering.
And do you want us to, that'll be a class discussion, or do you want us to send answers to them?
Send the answers and we can discuss it as a class as well. So I'm going to carve out time to have both, so that your project is meaningful to you, and then you can also share it with the students.
So email answers to the questions in advance of the class, expecting to discuss them Thursday
class.
evening. Okay, got it.
For medical transportation with the elderly, did you come up with a 1-page written summary that we might be able to look at as an example?
I can really dig it up.
It ties into one of the things we're working on.
Something you're working on?
Elders and transportation, yeah.
I
Great Panthers,
elderly. I had a presentation I put together, like a 3-minute PowerPoint presentation. So when you think about this, on December 5th, how you want to present your project is another thing. Do you want to come in and have a conversation? Do you want to do a PowerPoint? Or do you have poster boards that you want to put together and present? So I'm going to leave it up to you, really, on how to best present your project. And the rule of thumb with council is always a 3-minute clock. So I'm going to keep it as that, as 3-minute clock and timeout. Okay.
Is that firm at 3 minutes? Like,
Pretty firm.
Okay.
You're out of City Hall. But no, the class, if it goes over 3, I'll be okay. But we'll give you a warning. So I do want to get started. I do want to proceed with the class. We could talk more about the project, but we have 2 of my very well-respected colleagues here, Sumi, Malik, and Marisa, DeMull. Yes, got it. They have graciously offered their time to come to speak to us, and also some background work in prepping for this course. And one of the things that had come as a result of a couple of organizations and meetings is there's an organization, a group called Women in
The Alliance of Women of Color and Transportation.
which is very new.
This is
It's
about a
very
year
new.
old, yeah.
Yeah, very new.
Yeah.
So that was how I met Marisa. And it came, we can talk more about it. And then Sumi is also a colleague of mine from many years ago. But I will do an introduction. Primarily what we're gonna do is planning and engineering for equitable systems. So you've got a planner and an engineer to come in to talk about how you plan for systems in an equitable way in which we have not had these conversations in our industry as much. But we've got some experts, really. And Marisa's been talking about it for many, many months at conferences. And Sumi's also been working behind the scenes in planning to, managing projects where they're at. other firms. So we're really happy to have them, but I could do a formal introduction. Okay. Okay. We have a little bit, we have time. So Sumi is a graduate of Master's in Urban Regional Planning, and she's been practicing for 16 years. She's a Portland planning manager with HDR, a global civil engineering firm here in Portland. And as a project manager, Sumi delivers projects for a number of studies for state and local agencies, running on facility projects, doing a lot of stakeholder engagement, outreach, and interagency coordination. And as a long-range multimodal planner, Sumi has focused her career on developing policies and systems that implement the livability goals of the community she serves. Sumi, awesome. And so I think what they're going to do in the presentation is actually do a tag team. So I'm going to introduce Marisa as well. With a passion for combining safety and equity, Marisa is a longtime social justice activist. From her career as a political and labor organizer, her current career in advanced or accessible pedestrian and bikeway design, she centered her career and her work with vulnerable communities. So here we are.
My partner and daughter are watching, so. So what's going to happen here is Sumi's presentation is technically first, but I have a bunch of equity definitions that I do because I talk a lot about equity around the community. So I'm going to do those definitions. Paulina, Kate, welcome back. Good to see you again for the third or fourth time. Okay, so I appreciate it. So actually, we're starting with Sumi's presentation. It's very confusing the way that we did this, so my apologies. Here we go. So, you know what, Sumi, actually, you are up first.
Yeah, you're up
Let's
first.
come up here. You come
Okay,
up here.
that's
We'll do
fine,
this
that's fine.
together.
And that's fine if you.
And I'll just jump in with some
Yeah.
definitions.
Yeah. So, well, nice to see you, Kate. First, thanks so much for braving the weather and being here. It was kind of miserable with even the 10-minute walk over. I actually took this class in 2002 and then subsequently went back to school and got my master's in urban and regional planning at PSU. No pressure at all, and totally kidding. But I am so delighted to be here and speaking with you all because I know this was extremely meaningful to me in my life, and I think that this is a really powerful class. So I'm excited to see you all here. Yeah, so I guess if you want to advance the slide, or shall I? This one? Yeah, so then this is actually where Marisa jumps in. So you guys are going to tag team. Okay, oh, okay. Shall we do this? Okay. So I just wanted to talk, so this is what I'll be talking about, different types of equity and why focus on social justice, role, knowing that most folks here are citizens, just trying to point out ways in which you can get involved and the role of advisory committees and other forms of participation. An example of, actually it's just one, an equity criterion, and mitigating impacts to vulnerable populations. And then also evaluating outcomes, because intentions are all good and well, but what we're really after is trying to change outcomes. So yeah, so that's what I'll be talking about.
Okay, quick
Yeah,
primer on
interjection.
equity. Jump back in. So just really quickly, how many folks here have taken an equity training before? Oh, that's better than I thought. That's great. And so when we talk about equity, as those of you who have taken a training before may know, and those of you who have probably just heard the word a lot may know, it is a massive, massive amount of things that equity sort of entail. We are going to be really narrowing the focus today on racial and income equity, because those those impact our transportation systems here in Portland in a disproportionate way. So equity is an outcome and it's a process. Equity means the state or quality of being just and fair. So I know this is a lot of text. You are welcome to read it or watch this again and read it then. But because of systemic inequities that impact people, we look at equity in terms of race, income, ethnicity, gender, LGBTQ status, disability, incarceration record, body type, etc. There's a lot of types of inequities out there. And in the transportation system here in Portland in particular, we really focus on income and race. Now, as an outcome, we achieve racial equity and income equity when race and class no longer determines one's socioeconomic outcomes, which is just to say when everyone has what they need to thrive, no matter where they live or their race. And as a process, we apply racial and income equity when those most impacted by structural, racial, and class inequity are meaningful involved in the creation and implementation of institutional policies and practices that impact their life. Which is to say, this is a piece that Sumi is going to be really hitting today. And so that's like, how do our communities of color and our low-income communities, how are they involved in the process of planning for transportation in their community? And I will be really discussing equity outcome, which is how do we protect low-income and people of color in their communities in a way that puts them in the same level of protection as our white, middle, and upper class communities. Sorry, I just said I wasn't going to do it, and then I did it immediately. So to differentiate, for those of you who have not taken an equity course before, equality and equity are not the same thing. Equality occurs when institutions give equal opportunity to people of all races and all classes. Arguably, we can provide this and still have a disproportionate amount of pedestrian fatality or people of color not being involved in planning process. So we focus on equity to ensure that those things are made up for. And then my last definition is institutional racism. And I bring up racism because I'm going to talk about institutional racism. I'm going to talk about white supremacy culture. It's a really important thing for folks to hear because, one, it matters, and two, it affects every aspect of the work that we do. So institutional racism is the systemic distribution of resources, power, and opportunity in our society to the benefit of people who are white and the exclusion of people. All right, now I'm going to hand it back to Sumi.
Thank you, Marisa. And next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a little bit of a repeat of what Marisa said. But I'll just elaborate with my own spin on this. I think having practiced planning for about 16 years now, I think these are the ways in which people talk about equity and with respect to age, ability, gender, geography, oftentimes urban versus rural, modes, equity between active transportation versus automobile orientation. But really, I mean, I think that trying to approach all of these dilutes the importance of each one. And when we really want to achieve social justice, I think, as Marisa pointed out, it really really brings to the forefront issues of race and income. And so just to reiterate, that is what we're going to be focusing on this evening. Next slide, please. So because most folks here are citizens, I wanted to point out the role of advisory committees and other forms of participation. So one thing that even as a citizen participating in planning processes, I'll say, it's important to ask who's at the table, who's not at the table, who is being represented, who's not being represented. And certainly at least proportional representation is important, but But I would argue that overrepresentation of people who are typically underrepresented is even more important. And the reason why is because if you are, I mean, I can say this as a woman of color in, planning meetings. Oftentimes I am the only woman of color, often the only woman in the room, with a bunch of planners and engineers, and the only person of color. And so it takes a lot more courage for me to speak up and say and voice my point of view. And if there was presence of other people who look like me, then I would certainly feel more comfortable. And so I know that in some cases with some advisory committees, those communities that are underrepresented are actually sought out more. And perhaps they're not underrepresented, but underappreciated. And so that's something to look for even as a citizen to advocate for. Also, there are standing advisory committees like the Bicycle Advisory Committee that the City of Portland has, or the Pedestrian Advisory Committee. There are a number of advisory committees with the City of Portland that are standing that people come and talk about different projects and they weigh in on it, and they are advisory, so they aren't decision-making bodies, but they do provide feedback on those projects. And so that's one form in which you all could get involved. There are also project-specific advisory committees. So, so if there's a corridor plan, for example, then there's an advisory committee for that. And you can, if you live in the neighborhood, oftentimes there are applications solicited for these types of roles. And so certainly keep an eye out for those opportunities as well. But there are project-specific advisory committees. Then there are also open houses. And actually, that's how I got involved in planning myself. I went to an open house and I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't realize people did this for a living. And open houses, they tend to be project specific. They may be for a system-wide plan, like a transportation system plan. They may be for a bridge project, whatever it may be. They are usually location specific. So maybe in a public library or a school. And oftentimes projects are doing these online as well, because it's difficult for people to make it to a physical location at a particular time in order to participate. So in order to make it more accessible, there are opportunity. Oftentimes projects will have online open houses as well, so people can participate that way. And similarly, there are online surveys that are available, and so watch out for those as well. And so if you're involved in a project, I mean, these are at whatever level, these are things that you can advocate for. These are ways in which people can get involved. Next slide, please. And so if you are involved, one thing I wanted to point out is the importance of allyship and amplifying the voices of those that are underrepresented, for the very point that I mentioned earlier, that it does take a lot of courage to be the person who perhaps doesn't have the same experience as everybody else, or the same level of participation, or whatever it may be. It does take courage to speak up and advocate for their perspective. And so one thing that we can all use our own privilege for is to amplify those voices. And so if you find yourself in a committee or at an open house, something like that, please keenly listen. And if there's something that you think is valid, particularly from somebody who is underrepresented, then or from an underrepresented community, consider amplifying their voice, because it does matter a lot. And then I also wanted to bring up the concept of constructivist listening. So constructivist listening is non-hierarchical, non-authoritarian. Kind of focus on this last piece here too, but so when speaking, I think it's always really important in these kinds of situations to speak from your own personal experience. So to use I. Whenever people start to use you, or particularly you should, then that immediately puts others on the defense. And so, so it is helpful to speak from your own experience. And it takes some discipline to do that, and a good facilitator will keep you honest. But yeah, constructivist listening, so for the listener involved, they allow the speaker to express their feelings, construct personal understandings, and use their full intelligence, which comes in a variety of different ways, to respond creatively to situations rather than just relying on just sort of biases that have been developed over time, habits or rigid strategies, as it's put here. Okay, next slide. And Tweet, I don't know, did you want us to like pause for questions or questions after? I know we have an exercise as well.
We have an exercise. However you want to take
Okay.
it. So
I guess, yeah, does anybody have any questions so far? Yes, sir.
In at least one equity training, the facilitator used the term active listening. Is that a similar or somewhat dissimilar from constructivist listening?
I think it's similar to that. I think, I mean, it's very similar in that you are listening intently. You aren't distracting yourself. I think that, yeah, active listening, you're not necessarily thinking of the next thing that you're going to say, which I think is a way, I mean, I do that all the time. But you are actively listening. I think it also, with constructivist listening, I think it also employs the notion of the speaker and speaking from one's own experience. And so there's a little bit of responsibility on the speaking end too. Did somebody else have a question? Yes.
Yeah, I just, though the list of different ways of engaging advisory committees and participation, they are all volunteer commitments, right? Not paid.
Great point. Thank you for saying that, because that is actually something that has been changing. And I meant to say that. Good question. So now there are a lot of governments and a lot of projects, and I'm a consultant. And so all of the things that I'm saying are irrespective of any particular project, because I don't feel like I can say, I'm not a City of Portland employee, and so I'm not going to speak about City of Portland projects. But for example, yeah, there are many local jurisdictions that now pay a stipend to community leaders when they're involved, and that's something that is an emerging practice, and it's a good one because they have valuable expertise and their time is valuable, and they ought to be paid for those contributions. So yeah, so that's something that's increasingly happening. Okay, so this is just an example of an equity criterion. The city of, this is just an example. So the City of Portland's approach to transportation planning strives to center equity. And then it outlined in the citywide racial equity goals and strategies and PBOT's racial equity plan. I hope these slides are available to you afterwards, but it may be worth looking these plans up if you are unfamiliar with them. And PBOT also developed an equity matrix. So this criterion asks the question, would the project improve access, health, and safety for areas that score higher on the equity matrix? And the objective is to improve transportation access, safety for areas with high equity matrix scores. And so just to explain what that equity matrix is, it's a composite of those with higher percentage of the population who are people of color or Latinx, have a household income below the citywide median, or have a percentage of limited English proficiency households higher than the citywide median. So that is how the matrix has been developed, and it's a really great resource to always take your projects or whatever improvements and overlay them onto this equity matrix and really kind of think through who is this helping, and similarly, who does this have the potential to harm. So so that's definitely, the link is down here to find that equity matrix. Next slide. And go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question. I don't feel like you have to wait for me. Yes.
What is there like a term for paying like the volunteers, or people that might be on a committee that you were talking about? Is that-
Yeah,
is there
just
like
a stipend.
It would just be,
Mhm.
but is there like a new, like equity stipend terminology or just?
I don't know. I mean, I guess I've just heard it called a stipend for community leaders. Some other times there, daycare service is provided as well, you know, so that the burden of participation is reduced for people. But stipend is what I've heard. I don't know if others have heard anything differently than that. Yeah. Yes.
Are you presenting this partially related to our projects, in that in our projects we should be looking at this?
The projects that you would be really working on?
Correct.
To some degree, yes.
Yeah, hopefully this
Yes.
informs it, yeah.
Yeah, this should inform it because this is a huge objective of the course.
Okay.
And also the readings with the PBOT equity report and a couple of others that you have listed were recommended readings from the syllabus as well.
Definitely. It's just the project is kind of specific to me and my neighborhood, and I'm a middle class white neighborhood. So
How does that translate to equity? Is that the question?
correct. And it's hard for me to promote lower income when my area is basically middle class, or racial when it's not very racially diverse. I'm in Rose City Park, which is about the average for city of Portland. It's not higher or lower. It has a pretty mixed population, or as mixed as Portland is.
Yeah, well, I grew up in that community.
Oh, okay.
So I'm very familiar with Rose City Park. So at one point in the 80s, it was very diverse and there was a lot of low income, and I was came from the communities of color within that neighborhood. I went to Rose City Park, grade school and Rice School. So I'm really familiar with that area. So the question I have is, if you have a project within your neighborhood, perhaps at one point in the history, there were diverse communities that had lived there, or as you plan, what you're also thinking about is these projects are very specific to you, but I think what's really important is how you look outside the box and long term, how does this street or how this improvement affects other people? We can talk about that.
PBOT's in the middle of a very big project at 60th and Halsey.
Yeah, I know. I grew up not far from there.
And
Let's chat after. Let's chat because I want Sumi to have some time to finish her presentation.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, but that's actually a pretty good segue.
Yeah.
That's right up on the screen. So mitigating impacts to vulnerable populations. And one way in which you can do that, like as Twee was mentioning, is that oftentimes when there's a transportation investment, some kind of an intersection upgrade, bike lanes, whatever it may be, the perception from those who are living there at the time is that this is for future residents. And when those kinds of transportation improvements are made, adjacent property values are bid up, the land value goes up, there's pressure for redevelopment, and it has the effect of displacing populations, and that's gentrification. So then one mitigation is anti-displacement strategies, focusing on populations at risk for displacement due to transportation investments. Ways to mitigate, and this is where I will honestly admit, being a transportation planner, this is land use, and this is something that is not within my wheelhouse, or I'm not as familiar with, and that's unfortunate because the community experiences both land use and transportation, and I know that people are very frustrated when I say things like, oh, but this is a transportation project, it's not a land use project. Who cares? Who cares about your bureaucratic silos? And so then honestly, this is something with which I should be much more familiar because transportation projects have these effects. But so provision a provision and investment in affordable housing. One form of that is inclusionary housing, which requires that all residential buildings proposing 20 or more units or X number of units provide a percentage of the units at rents affordable to households at 80% of median family income. And that is actually within the city of Portland, and it is 20 or more units. And I think this clause here that it's households at 80% of median family income is really important. So it's a lot of times there's sort of those that are extremely low income are targeted with government programs and subsidies, but you know, making something affordable for those who may be just below the median income is also important. So not just our least, you know, those with the least income, but those who are just below the average. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so I love your chart on the right, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's not mine personally, but.
Oh, okay. But one of the things that I've been having trouble understanding is how folks in rural communities can adapt that kind of chart. And I was kind of wondering if you had any thoughts on that or feedback. Yeah, right, because folks can be a little bit more spread out. Or is this particularly for like more of an urban walkable mode and that kind of thing? Or if you've got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is designed for more urban. So I'll talk about that. I just want to talk a little bit about land banking, and then I'll go to this modal hierarchy, which is what that is. But I'll answer your question. And that's a great question about rural communities as well. So land banking, that is also, so there are, so land banking involves basically what it implies, which is that entities purchase, they gather up the capital and they purchase large sections of land for the provision of affordable housing or community center. And examples of institutions that do this type of work, that do land banking: Verde, Hacienda, CDC, Community Development Corporation, Native American Youth and Family Center, NAA, Habitat for Humanity. They're all participants in land banking. So that's also another anti-displacement strategy. So to get to your question, so what this is modal hierarchy, and this is actually in the the City of Portland Transportation System Plan, and also the 2035 Comprehensive Plan. And this puts pedestrians first. It sort of upends our existing system. It puts pedestrians first, bicycles second, our most vulnerable users, then public transit, freight, and then car share, taxi, and finally at the bottom, private automobiles or single occupancy vehicles, which is really like, this is what our system has been designed for primarily. And so it totally upends that. So one thing that I think about is, and I'll address an urban setting first. This fits well in the central city. There are complete sidewalks. Origins and destinations are pretty close. The density is pretty high. There may be bicycle facilities, public transit, because TriMet operates on a hub and spoke sort of system. Lots of the lines come in and go out. There's a lot of public transit that's available in the central city. This would be a great example of where that modal hierarchy works really well. I live a few blocks away from here. I work a few blocks away from here. I don't own a car. I haven't for 10 years. It's really expensive to live here. It's really, really expensive. And so where does this modal hierarchy not work as well? Someplace like East Portland, let's say, past 82nd. We want to protect our most vulnerable users, and that's where, honestly, as a planner, you don't always have a ready answer to things. You puzzle through these things with the community. So past 82nd, origins and destinations are further apart. Transit service isn't as good. Sidewalks aren't as inviting. You know, lots and lots of driveways, really auto-oriented, speeds are high. You know, I would argue in places like that, perhaps the provision of public transit is more important than, but at the same time, when we think about Vision Zero and we want to protect our most vulnerable users and we want to, you know, we want to protect pedestrians and bicycles, and you've got a limited right-of-way, you know, how do you allocate that space? So these are the kinds of questions that we grapple with. And then to get to your question, as far as the rural, people still have needs for, so I've done some planning in rural areas as well. People still have needs for local circulation. Kids still need to be able to walk to school. Kids still need to be able to wait for the school bus on their corner. And so, yeah, so I mean, there may be some type of hierarchy of modes that are tied perhaps more to specific streets. But nonetheless, it's something that, you know, you still want a complete system in a rural area. And I feel like I'm getting long on time. I don't know. Yeah.
Sorry, you just said the complete system, and I feel like in the reading for today, there was something about complete streets. And it wasn't, I didn't feel like it was well defined. Is that something that has a strict definition?
Complete streets typically apply to a given street, like an arterial, and that all modes of transportation have right of way on that street, so on that cross section. So there's bike facilities, pedestrian, transit, and so that street in and of itself is complete. A complete system is one where there's a system for pedestrians, for transit, for bikes, but they may not all coexist on the same street. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And I feel like I should wrap it up. So is that the last one? Oh, okay. The next slide, please. Last one.
Before you,
Oh.
what's the very small triangle say?
Oh, that it says like private automobiles.
Private.
Okay.
So does that include parking?
Yes, yes. I mean, that would include like parking lots and, I mean, that parking facilitates the use of automobiles. Yes. But parking is oftentimes on, I mean, that it could include on-street parking. So evaluating outcomes. So intentions are great, but the outcomes are what matter. And I would argue that a lot of times people, when they think about doing equity work, they think that it just amounts to outreach. But really, it is how are we planning differently? How are we designing differently? Which is what Marisa will talk about. We want to have performance metrics that evaluate plans and projects, and we want to streamline the decision making. So here are some examples of right. Okay, so streamlining the decision making. If you know what kind of outcomes you want to achieve, then that really helps you decide on what the solutions are. So here are some examples of evaluation or performance metrics. Crash rates with a focus on severe injury and fatalities. And by the way, right now, no racial data is collected, so that is a barrier. Bicycle and pedestrian level of stress. And accessibility, are people able to get to where they want to go by mode? Lane miles or service hours, this would be in the case of transit. So those would be ways to evaluate whether or not progress is being made. So, and I want to respect Marisa's presentation and pass it along to her. Thank you so much for being an engaged audience.
Okay, so I actually okay, perfect. So I should rotate this one. And then there's like notes that will show up underneath it. Sorry, it wouldn't be a presentation of mine if there weren't technical difficulties, so I'm making that happen. There we go. Okay. Okay, this will work. I'm gonna hang out next to you. What's up? So my name is Marisa DeMull, and thank you for listening to me. I'm going to stand in front of you and make a very unpopular argument, which is that transportation engineers today, right now, at this moment, need to be working on racial equity and income equity. And for folks who, actually, does anybody here know what a transportation engineer does? That's a hard question. Yes.
Like iffy.
What was that?
So I'm iffy on
Okay,
it. But, you know.
give me your best guess. Let's hear your best guess.
Oh, transportation engineers, right? Probably do more of the designing and more technical advising to transportation planners.
That's pretty accurate. We do. We do the technical side, the code, evaluation, and for the planners. But there's another big piece that we do. Does anybody know what it is? Really big thing that engineers do.
Design.
And then the other part of that is build. Build, that's right. So we design and build. So we work with the planners to make sure that all that great stuff Sumi was talking about, we make sure that it is technically correct, that when they say they want a 60-foot roadway, they're not giving us 80 feet of plans inside of there, right? We make sure that the math works. And then we take it and we make construction documents out of that. And for a very long time, folks have assumed that that is, and this is the thing that Sue is talking about, universal. There's a universal code and a universal design standard that we can achieve, which is to say that if I were to cross the street and Kay were to cross the street and this gentleman and you were to cross the street, every car would react to us exactly the same, right? There would be no difference. They would see us equally. No matter the lighting, no matter the infrastructure, no matter the driver, the vehicle, everybody gets treated the same. Now, obviously, that's one. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm going to give you a summary. So these are the three topics, and I do this talk a lot. I usually speak to engineers, so I really want to give you what you need for your projects. So anybody that has questions, please jump in, ask me any questions you want about engineering. I'm super happy to answer them. But I also want to hit equity pretty hard because I want folks to understand why that pyramid looks the way that it does for the 2035 plan. Why pedestrians are at the top, like with the bullet. It's actually really poor case considering what I'm about to talk about. But really, they're at the top. I'm about to talk about pet fatalities for like 20 minutes. It was like really poor taste. And why that's such a big part of how we plan for the city. So the first thing is that people of color and low-income people are disproportionately impacted. And I will go into this in such incredible detail that you will remember nothing else from tonight except for how upsetting it was about the disproportionate impact of pet fatalities on people of color and low-income communities. And then I'm going to talk about what racial equity would look like if engineers were to start implementing that. And then I'm going to give you some treatment ideas to think about for your projects, and then also just to think about for how they would look and act in communities of color and low communities. And then the first thing to start off are, nope, I did it again. No, it's fine. I have a video. It should do that. So the first thing is a video. We'll see if it plays. If not, I'll just tell you what's going on. That's so great. It should have just clicked and play. I willed it. I willed it into reality. Okay, it says loading. That's excellent. That's what I get for joking about technical difficulties. This one's on me. Anybody heard of Devontae Shipman? Does that name ring a bell? Walking While Black. Does that ring a bell? Yep, that rings a bell. Yes. What do you know about Walking While Black? What have you heard about it that you can remember? Yeah.
I mean, the term is feeling like there's some deja vu behind it or something. I just have seen lots of headlines and I've heard lots of stories, and having grown up in a conservative family and in a situation where we were, I don't know, middle income, but considered that other people were getting a leg up that we didn't, and hearing all that narrative all the time. The truth is pushed through, and there's just been enough reality that now I'm
What was it that we did wrong, officer?
I'm a very deep person, but anyway, sorry, that's lengthy, but
No, that's actually very important.
I've just been convinced that I am just insanely privileged in a way that's really unfair to everybody else. Like gender, race, income status. I mean, I feel completely comfortable walking just about anywhere in Portland late at night, late at night, and I know that's not the case for everyone.
That's an excellent answer. I appreciate you sharing that.
Sorry, I was so rambling.
No, I think it's nice for people of color to hear stuff like that sometimes. Because it's the truth. Because it is the truth. It is the truth. So this video is going to play, and I think.
Take your camera and point it across there at the red hand. That is a crosswalk. One, you weren't in the crosswalk. Two, there was a red sign. You both crossed it. Oh, my bad. That's a $65 ticket apiece. Get to my car. You are being legally detained.
We just crossed the street without following the sign. That was it. And we got stopped.
The young man in this video's name is Devontae Shipman. And he stopped right here in Jacksonville, Florida, threatened with jail time for essentially jaywalking.
You did do something illegal. You crossed the crosswalk.
Yeah, that's
against a red hand. I was sitting right there when you did it.
Wasn't paying no attention. That's not that. You act like I really just committed a serious crime that's worth this time right now.
It is worth the time. Walk to my car. I'm about to put you in jail.
It's not often we report on jaywalking. It's a minor infraction.
Okay. So, has anybody seen the Devontae Shipman? Now that you've seen a bit of it, you've seen it before. It was very popular on social media for a little bit. And it came out during this time when there was a lot of videos about how people of color, Black folks in particular, are treated so unequally by law enforcement. And I think one of the things that's sort of hidden inside of there is actually that our transportation system is providing them with this device that allows them to do this, which is that pedestrians between curb to curb, that's not ours, right? That belongs to the cars legally. So this person, and I sent like a million links to you, and I don't expect you all to have read them all, but this person and many like him get tickets for pedestrian use of the roadway, which sounds crazy, because it is crazy. These are laws that were made up, let me switch to the next slide, that were made up by the car industry 100+ years ago in order to prevent pedestrians from using what they considered legally theirs, and also because pedestrians were being killed in massive numbers by their new machines. Who is driving that new machine? Guesses? Wealthy people, right? White people, right? So they are killing the poor and the people of color. And so we have to do something to fix this problem. What's the best way to do that? Well, let's just get them off the road, and we get the right of way. We get all of the road for ourselves. And then if they get on the road, they get to get. So one of the more horrifying pieces of our infrastructure as it exists today is that in almost every state in the country, as a pedestrian, you can be ticketed for being hit by a car. It's very real. This is the Google search, one Google search that will get you these results. No matter how severe the injuries, no matter how legal it feels like this person was acting, they were ticketed. And in some of the more devastating pieces, I would say, first, I was just disappointed that it's also happening in Canada, because I expect more from them. And then I was also really dismayed by this information. 11 years old, hit by a car, ticketed. In this instance, the police showed up to the hospital to ticket her. So we are not providing, by any stretch of the imagination, a safe place for people of color, for low-income people to walk, which all of us did to get to this class today. All of us acted as pedestrians today to come here. And yet, this is sort of how we are, how we are treating even our most vulnerable people. This person in a wheelchair in Denver, crossing, started at the light flash to the hand, didn't make it across the crosswalk, in the crosswalk. So, of course, the devastating reality here is that almost universally, in the vast, vast majority, in crashes that kill pedestrians, the driver is not. Okay. Do you understand why the bullet thing was like really morbid now? Yeah. Super morbid. Here we go. Fatal pedestrian crashes. So I have been thinking about this for a while. I've lived in the city for about 10 years, and coming up here, like with you, it upended my ideas about how we use our roads. And as an engineer in school, they teach you about cars. How do cars drive on these things? Are we making it the best, widest, easiest, fastest road it can be for cars? And even here at Portland State, although there's definitely a movement against that, the fundamentals just don't change. Like, this is what our code says. So when we start seeing numbers like this, where we're going to almost double our pedestrian fatality rates, we have to really start thinking harder about what's happening. So starting in, I know the exact year because it is the year that the country started switching to LED light bulbs. Coincidence? I don't know. Conspiracy theory? Absolutely. 2007, we started seeing this uptick in our pedestrian fatalities. And here we are, this only goes to 2015, but here we are 2019, and we are off this chart. Our ped fatalities are skyrocketing. Most of them are happening at nighttime. We do not know why. What we do know is that people of color, as I have been saying this whole time when we give you the data on it, people of color are disproportionately impacted. The red bar represents the percentage of the US population, and the gray bar represents the percentage of pedestrian fatalities. Non-white, 46%. This number is increasing. So people of color in the United States, we make up about 33% of the population. So why are we almost 50% of the ped fatalities? I don't know. We don't know. Some of us have it worse, right? Native Americans, the number looks so small, it's really hard to see it. But 0.7% of the population, 2.7%. Four times their representation. In a place, I believe, here, North Dakota. Yep. In North Dakota, Native Americans make up 5% of the population, and thank you, 38% of the pedestrian fatalities. A stunning, horrifying thing.
So you know the statistics more than we do. Are there variables, or this is the quantitative? For example, I had a friend who did research on Navajos with 4 state corners, and in that case, pedestrians and alcohol was blamed fairly or not as one of the reasons. Does any of this data include elderly and disabled pedestrians with the same racial disparities?
It's all, although this all has to come with a caveat, and I'm glad you mentioned that Sumi mentioned, which is a lot of states don't collect race data because they don't consider it to be a condition that impacted the fatality. So as in Oregon, we don't know. We don't know in Oregon. These are just from the states that have collected it. New Mexico collects it and Arizona collects it. I know because there's studies going back to the early 80s in New Mexico that show that Latinos and Native Americans are more likely to be killed. So we've had it for a while. We've known for quite a while.
And the Yopano organization, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, is working pretty tightly with legislation right now to get census data collected across this, not just within, not just for Portland and the communities out in East Portland and the Jade District, but actually across the board of all of Oregon. So they're collecting, they're going on to legislation to make sure that that does get passed.
That's excellent.
So the data gets collected, because it hasn't been collected.
It has not been collected, you are correct.
So the red line saying the percentage of the total population, those are of the states that reported, or are
That's
they
correct.
of the US as a whole?
Of the states that report and collect racial.
So it is directly comparable. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And I had a statistician who's very irritating in one of these who argued me tooth and nail because he said not enough states collect that data to extrapolate.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I was like, and that's the point that I am also making, like we're on the same side.
Yeah.
Because if that's just the states that collect, imagine if we had a national picture. So I skipped a few slides because I want to get to the thing that is really impactful for your project. But one of the guesses as to why this is happening is that this is a result of implicit bias, which we know, we don't know. Implicit bias, we know. Yeah. We experience some of it, yes. Probably all of us experience some level, actually. Mm-hmm. So implicit bias has been studied a few times at Portland State twice and another university one time. And it has been shown that people are less likely to stop for pedestrians in poor neighborhoods and for Black pedestrians. That's something we can definitively say now. Cars are less likely to stop for Black people and for poor people. So, as pedestrians. So if that's the case, it does lead us to a natural conclusion, which is to say that these ped fatalities, the rise, the huge numbers of people of color, right? We can start to put together this idea that, in fact, the way that we're designing our infrastructure, the way that engineers are doing our job needs to be improved because it needs to account for this missing factor. So, then what does that look like? You can do it.
While we're looking for that, last time we did this presentation, I asked you this question. I don't remember what that was. So those numbers, they are not normalized by the amount of people of color actually walking, right? Because we know that, people of color generally, they're less wealthy, so they do own less vehicles, fewer vehicles, and they do walk more. So how do those numbers, are those numbers normalized or not?
Yes. So Smart Growth America did take this into consideration for both low income and communities of color, and they have found still there's a significant discrepancy in the fatality And then the UNLV study actually did. So they did pedestrians in a low-income neighborhood. They have them crossing in a wealthier neighborhood. And yeah, the cars just don't stop. In a low-income neighborhood, like we just have a bias against poor people and for wealthy people. So, so this is the thing. This is my conclusion. This is my argument for engineers here.
This is game changing for engineering. It really is. Doing this for as long as I have, it's a game changer.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I wish you came to all my presentations.
Your background voice.
Yeah, so like cheer me on. So pedestrians in communities of color require better facilities and higher levels of protection to achieve the same level of safety as pedestrians and white people. So that's the definition of equity right there, right? So, I agree with that to side. Let's talk about some engineering treatments. Let's get to the meat and potatoes for your projects. If you're a project and you think, in fact, that you might be working in a community of color or a low-income community, or if you think it would be worth assessing that in the planning process, I would love it if you would think deeply and intentionally about your process and how it affects people of color. So I'm going to show you some slides here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what this experience might be for low-income and communities of color. And these slides all come from this book. Anybody know this book?
That's not the managed walkable city.
No, yes.
It looks like Jeff Speck's cover a little bit.
This is the
Street Design Guide.
Yay, you know it.
No, I can just read.
That was excellent. Thank you for that. So yeah, this is an NACDO Urban Street Design Guide. This is very popular. This is definitely impactful in Portland. If you are thinking about working in Portland or getting involved in Portland, I would highly recommend purchasing this book. It has great design examples for different locations, transit, not great, walking, biking. There's also the Urban Bikeway Design Guide, which is kind of a partner. There is a Rural Design Guide, which is also quite good if that's something you're interested in. All of it can be found online as well. So if you're looking for design treatments, it's a very easy, you can pick and choose, plop them in, kind of assess how they work. It gives you the different elements, like this one. We have planter trees here, bike parking, and this is a curb extension. Curb extension is about 6 to 8 feet past the curb into the road. It takes up probably 1 parking space on average. And what this does is narrow the roadway. So it shortens the crossing distance for a pedestrian, thereby making it theoretically safer. Usually these come paired with a crosswalk right here. And some lighting, which they have actually included. So I want to ask you a question. If we assume that implicit bias exists and pedestrians who are people of color are not likely to be stopped when they are seen very visibly, do we think this would be a good treatment? Yes, no? Rick? Anybody want to defend their answer?
I guess it seems like, to the extent that that is a problem, you might want to have more treatments that just, more stoplights or things that just sort of force cars to stop rather than relying on them to make the decision to stop for someone who wants to cross.
Yeah.
So the curb extensions do shorten the crossing distance, so it puts the pedestrian out and makes them more visible before they're actually off the curb.
Yeah.
But it would also have to be paired with lighting at the crossing to make sure that they were still seen or more likely to be seen at that point. And maybe without the trees, which are also blocking visibility.
That's a good catch, and I agree. I don't know why this is in their example. I would never have put trees there.
Where the
This-
crosswalk should be.
Yeah, exactly. This ped level lighting is really nice. One thing I like to think about too, though, when we think about how we light our streets, if I were to put this light right here, you're getting a good view of my face. I look pretty visible, yeah? But this is how we light our roads, right? It's right above your head. So you're going across the street and you're waiting forever, like, why is nobody stopping for me? If we were to put it on a bollard, right? Yeah, huge difference. We're not really thinking at that level yet. I'm hoping we get there, but it's just something for you to consider as you go about planning your sites.
By narrowing the roadway, the cars should theoretically slow down. And hopefully it would make them slow enough so that if they did hit somebody, they didn't kill them.
In theory. That's a good theory. I have some more treatments to get to, and they are all going to be filled with questions. And we're going to do an activity, so I want to make sure we get to that. Let's talk about this one. This is a raised crosswalk and median. Any of you seen these? Okay. Yeah, we like to put them in low speed areas, 20 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour. We might stick something like this in. This is probably shopping or residential, dense urban area. Put this beautiful cut through on this median, and this person can just cruise right through here. This is called the speed table because it's flat table. Because yours are good at naming things. So you will see these in like a lot, I think in Pearl, I want to say. There's some in the downtown area where they have these raised. No, not the Pearl.
You have them at like the airport minus the median.
There we go.
There's one sort of like that at 16th and Burnside.
Okay. I believe you.
And up
I
on the
don't know
hill,
any of these neighborhoods.
near the zoo,
Okay.
somewhere? I forget.
Airport is a good example there too of like a slow speed area, right? But you saw a lot of ped traffic. That's kind of where we were going for that. Things to note here, you have your lighting, your ped level lighting. We have some signage. I would want to see a lot more. It's not visible down the street to kind of let folks know before they stop. This is a 20 to 50. This was a community of color. I would put that at 50 because we know it's going to take them longer to stop. That's also in the studies that we've seen. Rectangular rapid flashing beacons. These are all over the city. Portland loves these right now, which I'm glad about. They're working great. This is a very troubling example. Like, what happens after here?
Oh my God.
Stop. Right. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. It's also from the Urban Bikeway guide, so I pulled it. But anyway, this is RFB. It's a push button. Who's used them? Everybody? Right. We know how they work.
The beg button?
Yes, the big button.
That's the appropriate term.
I was talking to a guy recently about passive detection. That's something that's coming where you would just walk up and it would indicate because
The ultraviolet, we have the ultraviolet bicycle detectors and stuff. So
yeah, it's time, right? Pet detection, it's time. Yes.
I just had a question about like the bollard lighting you're speaking of. Like, is there any like substantial reason why that hasn't been used? Like, is it just new technology? Is it just people want to stick to the old stuff? Like,
It's not a good reason I can.
okay, well that's like motivating then.
It's European style. They do it a bit. The vendors I found were like from Holland and I want to say Germany. So, but it's not super common here. We do it on trails all the time though, which is the irony.
Yeah.
I work at Alta Planning and Design, and we do a lot of trail design. We put them in everywhere. So
yeah, that's great.
yeah, we put them in everywhere. So this is a great example of what you would use. This is a 4-lane roadway. We would want probably 35 to 40 mile an hour roads and up. We would want to put something like this in, or if there's a lot like a visibility issue, like say it's the corner, right? You want to make sure that you have something that
lets people know from a distance that there's pedestrians that are going to be entering the roadway.
Well, like, I have a question. Sorry.
Yeah.
How does this, like in the triangle, how does this build equity for pedestrians? Like making them have to do one more thing that like if they don't push it or if, you know, like it's just one more way to blame them or like.
The RFBs?
No, yeah, like the blinkies.
Yeah,
Like,
sorry, yeah, so I shortened it, yes, the flashing beacons.
Like, and also drivers don't have to stop still. They can still choose to drive through them.
They do legally have to stop.
But
They might not,
Yeah.
that's a different thing, but they do legally have to stop.
But they have to legally stop if you're standing there.
That's right. The objective is, and the reason that we consider this to be an equitable treatment is that this here actually takes these implicit bias factors out of the equation. Because when you have a flashing light at night coming at you, you're not looking at the race, gender, dress of the person who's standing there, right? You're seeing the flashing light and you're either complying or you're not complying with the light. If you see potentially a young Black man standing there and you're waiting, he's waiting to get somebody to let him cross the street, he is a lot less likely on his own to be able to cross than if we gave him an option to push a button and cross the street.
And the study that looked at, you know, people stop for pedestrians of color versus white people, did it look at who was driving the car? Like, was everybody white not stopping for, like, it's also people of color not stopping for people of color. So is that a race thing? Is that a class thing? Is that a?
I mean, societally, it's about, right, white supremacy culture, which I was talking about earlier, but I didn't bring up again. But yeah, biases exist across our culture, across all parts of our culture, unfortunately. So, do you have a question? Yeah.
Yes. Going off your racial equity and engineering, like based off that definition, once gentrification happens, does the definition changes for that specific area?
That's a tough question. That's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, presumably, yes, it would change, right?
Because that's like ideal, like in reality, when things do happen that way. For example, the Gateway District. I don't know if any people know about Gateway, but it's like, you know, 102nd and Halsey. It's much more developed and pedestrian friendly what it used to be. But in the next 5 years, what will the population look like, and will the definition change, since it won't be racial equity, since it may not be people of color living in that area during that time?
I live in Woodlawn, and we're having a similar.
Off of
We're having a similar experience right now.
Teagan is huge.
I mean, I think that's where it gets to transportation and land use interact with one another. And so that's why anti-displacement strategies are important. So you put in some kind of a transportation improvement, and you also put in some kind of corresponding land use treatment that helps keep the folks that are there, that it's not a treatment for, you know, like more affluent people who perhaps would be living there in the future. That's my off the cuff answer.
Yeah, so it's pretty much more policy things that kind of come into play to do that. And also to comment off of your question, I think people, no matter what their social economic status or gender or color, people may not be aware of the policies of crossing the street. So for example, a lot of people don't know how the intention to walk is like when you intend to walk, the driver is legally have to stop. But a lot of people don't intend to walk because they don't feel safe to do that action. So I don't know if that it was just a comment that arose when, and that's no matter who you are, background wise, if the person don't feel safe to attempt to walk, they're not going to try to walk.
That's a really good point.
In terms of Gateway, briefly, Joanne Hardesty's radio program on cable this morning was talking about Gateway as a neighborhood in terms of displacement and racism. I don't know if anyone else was listening to that, but her specific question was and she's on city council, the first African-American woman on city council in Portland's history. What about private corporations that have a connection in terms of gentrification, specifically that Fred Meyer at Gateway? Joanne was talking about, I haven't seen it since changes. You may have already been there. She said that in her belief, she's boycotting Fred Meyer, that one at least, or all of them, because it's been changed internally in the store, allegedly to prevent shoplifting. But she feels like each section of the store is now blocked off completely. In terms of design, I mean, it's not a public street or sidewalks, but as a way to deter people who feel unsafe, where they're being harassed by security guards. Or at Portland State, we've dealt with it in a different example of doing court watch for jaywalking people who are low income. So we've gone to court to argue creative ways of getting people out of being fined when they're targeted as a vulnerable population, and has had some success doing that. So that may not be germane to the engineering for streets and sidewalks. But.
I'm being told we're moving on. Sorry.
Thank you.
The last thing is just a mid-block pedestrian safety island, and I think that's actually been explained already, so we can head to the next thing, which I think is great. Don't worry about this. I'm not gonna worry about that either. But
Let's break for 10 minutes, because I think we all need a break. And then we'll come back and exercise.
I'm here if you all want to talk to me. We designed these first time. Yeah, wanted a better one. Right, your street in the middle, like lower.
Yeah, you have an area, you retake the streets, right lane, or retake the actually property. So there's the market, and how they're having the real estate market. It's not, and those parcels that are they're now seen as more valuable than the street. There's infrastructure, there's neighbors.
How do you feel?
15 minutes. 15 minutes before we come and we're gonna do an exercise. So, we have printouts, but the pictures did not show up very well in black and white, so we have it up here. This is a zoomed out study area. And what we want to do is do some traffic treatments. And I took out I never do this, actually. I'm very particular with street signs and street names, so I always have to make sure. But just this is a intersection. This is a street in East Portland, and it's not identifiable. Yeah, she asked me to take it off. It could be anywhere and everywhere. So this is the big study area of it, and then if you can go to the next photo, it's a zoomed in photo of what this is. So here is your project.
Yeah, I can go ahead and describe it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so this is just an exercise that we'll do, and hopefully we'll have like 5 minutes for report out, something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah. So, so the conditions are listed here, and perhaps what you can do is just at your long tables, like get into a small group, maybe 3 people together, and think about, so the existing condition is it's an arterial, 2 lanes, two travel lanes or traffic lanes in each direction, no bike facilities, curb tight sidewalks, so no planter strip or anything like that. And there's a center turn lane. Posted speed is about 35 miles per hour, so just above a survivable speed. If you're a pedestrian, that's 31 miles per hour. And there's overhead lighting on only one side of the street, and it's like Cobra kind of highway type of lighting. And there's a library here and shopping center here with a bunch of parking. As you can see, it's very auto oriented. And so, yeah, and there had been a serious injury of somebody trying to cross the street there. And I guess for the purposes of this exercise, pretend like that doesn't necessarily exist, just as described.
The crosswalk doesn't exist.
The crosswalk doesn't exist. So yeah, so how would you design, or you can assume that that's there. How would you design a mid-block crossing? And then on the back of your page, there are questions that we would like you to, and it's not just the design, but how would you plan for it as well? So since we've been talking about planning and designing. So what is the design intent? How does this help the community now and in the future? How are you framing the problem? What's your planning process? Who are you talking to? What's your actual treatment? And how are you mitigating for unintended consequences? And how might you evaluate the project? So figure that all out in 10 minutes. Yes, ma'am.
The bike lanes, do you assume they're not, because it says no bike facilities, but on the map, there are bike facilities. Do you
Right.
assume they're
Yeah,
exist, or do you
yeah, if
assume
you can
they-
stick with the exercise and
Okay.
not necessarily the picture here, but yeah. So how about it? No, I mean, are you going to try to figure out?
I don't, okay.
So
what are some ideas that might hold you to design that would work in this case? So, yeah. I was with you yesterday.
Rob.
to each group and have 1 or 2 representatives talk about their takeaways. Or what do they envision going through these questions? How do you develop the planning process? And go through the design treatments that was presented in class. What would you recommend for improvement? Go. Yeah.
Well, I would first start with engage the community at step 1, not after you've kind of decided what you think is best. So starting, you mentioned using the library, of course, that's right there, and host the community meetings there where people are already, ask them what their needs or desires are for the area before you even present the solution, because you don't necessarily know the problem.
Yeah, we figured this was a trick question, and the answer was, we shouldn't be figuring it out, but the community should be.
And then we sat back for the next 10 minutes. No. That was just one thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next group.
We missed the trick question. We started designing.
It's not Halloween yet.
We talked about kind of how all the different solutions or engineering concepts could be applied to this, but I think we thought in this situation, doing the speed table would be effective in slowing down cars on that really busy road, especially if it's a highly traffic crosswalk. But that it would be important to have signage to get the cars to slow down ahead of time before the table.
We also were thinking about the question about like now and in the future, like how maybe in the future there might be another large mass use building that's further down the block. Would you add another crosswalk there and then maybe another and another? It might disrupt the flow of traffic through that road, and would that change like how the road is used?
What I'm learning a lot in my work is nothing is permanent. So whatever change you make, it evolves over time, and it changes. The community changes, people change, and how traffic patterns also change.
So we were talking about meetings, but I think more trying to meet people where they are, so not like an evening time. So like having a table outside during different times of the day where, you know, you're interviewing the people that are using it, you know, that are trying to cross the street, trying to, you know, have a conversation with them. And I think from that, getting feedback and doing like a tactical or pilot change where people can actually experience, you know, for a period of time, maybe on the weekend where there's less traffic, and they can sort of see like, what would a, you know, curb extension look like, or what would a projected bike lane on this or a pedestrian island look like on this street?
Cool. Opportunities, a lot of opportunities. And also looking at it through from night to day, day to night, different times. And also seasonal too. We haven't really touched into that. Like seasonals change and catch basins get flooded with what's going to be like next week or the week after in the middle of fall. So that impacts travel.
And rain reflects light. In a
Yeah.
different way.
Yeah. Back group?
We just talked about like echoing what other people said. Get kind of first look at like any future plans in that area, because city, they're always doing future plans for 5-10 years. And while within that, being more aware of like community and engagement, see what they may want and their concerns. Put more, rapid beacon things in the area on like both sides, not just like on one side, but on the other side as well. And then may also put some kind of like mural or like sidewalk mural, bike mural to really help resemble what the community is. And who knows what that big parking lot will turn into in the next 10 years. So all those plans will be based off what the future what the city already has for that rezoning or other type of policies that may influence in that area within the years. And if anything that I'm missing, please feel free to.
Kind of like implementing universal design then.
Yeah.
I know that comes up quite a bit in our conversations, but universal design for everyone and for different types of uses, because you don't know who your users are now and then in the future. Yeah. And perfect.
I guess one of the things that nobody has mentioned yet, but we talked about is who are the people who aren't currently walking to the library, right? So it says there was a pedestrian fatality reported. Doesn't mean there all been one, but there has been only one. Doesn't mean that people just don't feel safe to actually cross the street and they just like don't cross it at all. So other like a lot of people who would like to walk but just don't walk at the moment because they cannot. So how can we target not only people who are walking to the library, but how the people who aren't currently walking to the library because they feel unsafe? And it probably goes beyond the budget of a project of putting in a crosswalk, but ideally, like, you know, like targeting the people in the like surrounding areas.
The radius of
and see like, hey, like what would it make it better for you to make you feel safer to actually walk to the library?
Knowing that area pretty well, I drive through, you traverse through there a lot. There's a transit center there, not too far away. There's a handful of apartment complex, and there's some homes. And there's a park near there. I've taken my dog out there, but it's not one of the safest places for you, me, or my dog. So there are some issues with like, what are the surrounding areas? What do you consider? Who's going to the library? Most of them drive. I had to drive to that library because I live so far out, but I wouldn't be able to take transit because of different modes that'll never get me there in time. So yeah, considering like within the radius who really use that library and plan for that, the future planning for that. You have a question? Yes.
Yeah, I just feel I'm familiar at that area too, and I feel it's not very safe. The car turn is everywhere.
Yep.
So I think for the safety treatments in the middle lane, have the middle island, that would be a better plan for that area. And because I have a library and another side have a big parking, so it won't be like affect the car parking on both of sides of the street.
Okay, one more, and then we're over time.
I'll try and keep it distinct, just like echo what y'all said about, you know, like engaging the people that are using the space is like essential. I think a library would be a great place to host that kind of discussion plans. Without knowing that information, we kind of worked a little bit on the design aspect, right? So we talked about the framework was like, how can we ensure that like someone who might be vision impaired or somebody that might be in a wheelchair or somebody that might have 3 kids that they're trying to wrangle, like how can we ensure that they feel safe in that median while crossing the street? So we talked about a speed table, we talked about a folded out island with a lane shift, we talked about a flashing beacon. I also love the idea of the bulge with the lighting. And then we also talked about how can we disrupt like the speed of cars, and one of the ways to do that we've heard is by having trees before and after to reduce the speed cues for drivers to speed up. And then we also talked about removing parking and the potential for putting in housing in that area.
You're the first person that mentioned about trees in a positive manner.
Oh, yeah. It's an idea.
It's an idea. I also sit on the Urban Forestry Commission, so it's interesting to grapple with land use and trees and lane widths and everything, but trees is good for sustainability and climate change, right? Which we will at some point talk about in class. So class is adjourned. We're 5 minutes overdue. Thank you so much. Oh, wait, before we part, I want to thank you, Marisa and Sumi. And I give you a round of applause.
Some of us had also talked about maybe going to get a drink after class. Yeah. Do we want to meet outside, have a meet outside the door and we'll walk over together if these classes